Szakonyi. I was playing for the home team here at GW, political science professor. I've just joined PONARS on Monopolies rising, consolidation in the Russian economy.
So thank you very much to the organizers of PONARS. I'm really happy to be here. This is my first PONARS event after becoming a member earlier this year. So I'm going to be especially vigilant about trying to keep to the 8 minutes in order to create a good first impression in my first year of membership. The title of this is Monopolies Rising, Consolidation in the Russian Economy. So just in case people want to check out, I'm going to argue first and foremost that the Russian economy is witnessing a clear trend towards consolidation and renationalization. That fewer firms across the economy, across sectors, across different sizes are facing competition within their own markets, and monopolies, I mean straight up natural monopolies, but also artificial monopolies that have accumulated over time are flourishing in many, many, many different sectors, and this has broad impacts across the political and economic landscape. So why does this matter? Why am I up here talking about concentration of markets and the way that firms are competing in a conference devoted towards maybe more political science or sociology? Well, first, market concentration is going to hurt growth rates first and foremost. It's going to stymie innovation, and most importantly, it's going to inhibit the development of alternate political groupings. And I'll go into more detail about the connection between how firms compete in the economy and how opposition challengers can compete with the ruling party regime. And secondly, this has implications for the current policy regime and international sanctions. And I'm going to argue that international sanctions become less effective at inducing elite defection under a situation where there's so much consolidation, but they do contribute to more sustained economic pain in the long run. So just to get the facts out before I go into the implications, how do we know that there's this evidence of consolidation? How do we know that firms are facing less and less competition? So what here I'm doing is looking at firm surveys by the Analytical Center of the Russian government, which is a really impressive think tank of very well-educated Russian bureaucrats that are trying to figure out where the different problems in the Russian economy lie. So there's about 1,000 firms that are surveyed every year from 2013 to 2016. They're asked very simply, what kind of competition are you facing in your sector? This is nice because it's annual. A lot of the firm surveys that I work on don't have the ability to look at this change over time, but we're seeing generally the same trend. What's most alarming about this is that in 2013, roughly 0.7% of all Russian firms in this survey said that they didn't face any competition. Just 4 years later, that's up to 13%. If you bring that together with those that are facing weak competition, almost 1/4 of all Russian firms are facing little to no competition in expanding their production or making profits. That aside, you're also seeing the Federal Anti-Monopoly Service uncovering cartels, partly through the help of bloggers like Navalny, but these cartels are moving into procurement and in coordinating the way that pharmaceuticals are being bought by the Russian government, the construction industry. There's just fewer and fewer firms, and it makes it easier for them to coordinate on some of the corruption. In my work on public procurement, we find that the vast majority of tenders and electronic auctions only have one bidder. So that way they don't actually have to compete over price. They get the reservation price, the starting point, just from the government without even having to lower it. 5 Russian banks control over 50% of Russian market share, and RBK over the summer uncovered that 50 Russian companies are responsible for 50% of all tax revenue for the government. So there's this incredible consolidation with large state corporations that are playing this disproportionate role within the economy. Why do we care about this? What might be the causes and consequences of these recent trends? So what is driving it? First, you can't really talk about these trends without thinking about the economic crises that have happened since 2008. What's the connection here? Well, during economic crises, smaller and weaker firms, those that don't have great access to capital, are kind of already on that flimsy line between profitability and loss. When the shock hits, they're much more vulnerable to going bankrupt, to closing up shop, and the entrepreneurs go look for work, say, in the state sector, than continuing to take the risks of running a business. The larger firms get bailed out. As we know from Pikoleva in 2008, the Russian government is really worried about maintaining employment levels very high, and they're very willing to give out subsidies and make sure that a lot of these really large corporations stay in force and that people just don't lose their jobs. So the shocks kind of clear out some of the underbrush of the small and medium enterprises, while the large enterprises can take advantage of their political connections and expand their market share during periods of crisis. So this is really important to say that there are some exogenous factors that are affecting the way that this consolidation has unfolded. Secondly, when you talk to these firms, and especially in these firm surveys, you ask, what is driving the lack of competition? And their first answer is the government itself. The different policies that the government is enacting are having anti-competitive effects. Usually you think the regulators are going to go in and fix the markets. They're going to go and prevent monopolies from emerging. In Russia, many instances, you see the exact opposite occurring. Import substitution, all this talk about protectionism, that just blocks foreign competitors from entering the Russian market and lets the domestic ones take over whatever share they had before they left. Politically connected firms can raise barrier to entry, making it much harder for these medium-sized enterprises to jump up to the next level, using regulations to their advantage to prevent their competitors from strengthening. And as we know, since 2004, with the Yukos affair, and even Sistema more recently in Bashnev, nationalization has been apparent across multiple sectors in the economy. State-owned enterprises are swallowing up smaller and private firms. Many state-owned enterprises are being consolidated into much larger ones, and the state is going to play a much bigger role in the economy itself than it ever has before, even under Putin. And finally, this idea that there's been really ineffective regulation by the bureaucrats that are responsible for regulating these monopolies. If you look at the list of natural monopolies and the people that are the entrepreneurs and businesses that are being accused of anti-competitive behavior in Russia, the vast majority, 60-70%, have the number of employees under 50. So the FOSS, or the Anti-Monopoly Service, is targeting the smallest players instead of going after, say, the export monopoly on gas for Gazprom, or going after some of the bigger corporations that are benefiting from these regulations. It's being consumed by, say, the single dairy producer in a village out in Irkutsk. Or its focus and its priorities are not on the big bad apples, but on the smaller entrepreneurs that are just trying to survive in a much more localized environments. Supposedly over the summer, they've been trying to reform this and shift the focus back to the bigger ones. There's a lot of fear or unwillingness to go after the players that are making the situation worse. Why do we care? Last year, there was this incredible fact that the Russian government is now responsible for 70% of GDP, whether directly or indirectly. How can private firms compete with the state? The state has officials on their board of directors. They have the access to policymakers and regulators to get what they want. If you're a private firm, you're much more vulnerable, you're much more exposed and dependent on making the same kind of inroads to the government, on giving minority shares or hiring some of the relatives of state officials in order to get that access. But any state-owned enterprise or any private firm with a large state share is going to have many more comparative advantages, and that's going to have implications for how private firms disperse across the economy. I won't go too much about how economic growth rates, but it's hard to disrupt an industry when you've got that major dominant player already there, putting up barriers, making it more difficult for your entrepreneurial life. And it's harder to get your ideas out and find investors and all that access to capital under this situation. Pocketbook effects. Think of our country, the consolidation that's gone in the airline industry, and how frustrated we are that airlines aren't providing the same high level of services because there's fewer and fewer of them since the 1980s. Same dynamics are happening in Russia. You're getting higher prices, lower quality goods. There's more and more evidence across nationally that the more market consolidation you have, the worse inequality gets, which is already really bad in Russia. It's only going to be made worse by these trends of concentration. And finally, from a more political science perspective, you need money to get the listovki out. You need money to mobilize protesters or pay for tents if you're going to do kind of that large-scale demonstrations, or to get candidates' name out there and buy TV and radio time. That money usually comes from private donors, in large part corporations, even in Russia. If all of the money or all of the market share is concentrated in state-owned enterprises, or if there's just a few private firms that are competing, they're much less likely to break camp and support opposition parties. Navalny's done a great job of raising small donations from individuals across the Russian economy, but he's been stymied time and time again trying to get access to the big money, because a lot of that big money is in companies that are benefiting from the current regulatory regime, and they're not worried about their competitors and might take an alternative political stance in order to make more money. They don't necessarily see the opposition as helping them increase their revenue and profitability. So just to conclude, where does this leave us from a more policy standpoint? Much of the international sanctions, especially from the US side, was designed to induce elite defections, to make the elite kind of question their loyalty to Putin and the inner circle, and then think about changes that are going to happen to that high-level regime. When there's so much consolidation, there's a small number of people that are actually sitting at that table, they're each controlling sectors without any real challenges to their market power, it's much harder for the sanctions to go and induce those splits and to make the elites question whether or not they want to continue to support the regime. So the sanctions are actually become less effective in the short run because the government knows exactly the key players that it needs to funnel money and regulations and preferential treatment to. And the elite players say, well, I'm not really suffering right now because of all these policies that are benefiting from me. I might just like hold out in the short run and continue to commit myself to the regime. However, I just talked about the effects on economic growth and the pocketbook issues. Long-term economic growth is going to be put under significant question. There's going to be these limited opportunities for small and medium enterprises to create jobs and to propel the Russian economy into a new and more advanced technological future. And you have this ever-present history of excessive state intervention in the markets. We know the problems of soft budget constraints. We know the problems when the state tries to run private companies and fails at doing that. So there are all these vulnerabilities that are emerging because not only is the state playing a much bigger role in the economy than it ever really has, but private firms are being destroyed or are backing out and people are finding alternate sources of employment in order to make their livelihood. Thank you.
Thank you. Although I must say, you failed in your test.
Yeah, 10.5 minutes.